live.
Awesome. It's better I start the whole session with a awesome instead of like a mid-sentence saying something. Hello, everyone. I am Sudha Jamte, and this is our weekly wed, our my happy space place every Wednesday where I get to talk to you. All January I was talking to you. Now I get to, come in periodically and do a little session or sit in and listen to amazing speakers. And thank you, Debika, for hosting this and getting the ship running. And LM, our intern, is the one who sends out all the emails and reminders that you get. And we have a newsletter, bit.ly/jamte newsletter. I'm just going to share that in a minute because I want to show you two courses that dropped and I've given free links in there. That goes out on Mondays, on the first Monday of the month, once a month. It's called Jamte Newsletter. It has jobs, events, call for papers, and it's basically AI opportunities that I share with you at Sudha Live. And for those of you who don't know me, who are watching on YouTube, we are streaming this onto YouTube, and then we'll get a recorded copy, and then we'll share that recording, or LM might do little clips for us. So I need your permission for those of you who are on Zoom. I see all of you off camera. So if you're going to be on camera or if you speak up, your voice will get into the recording. So if you don't want that, please turn off the cameras and use the chat button. Otherwise, you're essentially giving me permission to be in the recording, right? Okay. I don't have a choice. I'm going to be the recording because I'm going to be talking to you. Okay. And anybody who's new, this is WeeklyWed at Business School of AI, my learner community. And I'm Sudha Jamte. I'm a technology futurist joining you from Silicon Valley. And I love mentoring my students and I love every opportunity I get to talk to them. So here I am. So usually we have one speaker and we start this at 9 o'clock here, my time, which is 18 hours in CET and Nigeria, and 1 p.m. in Brazil. But this week we have a different approach where I'm going to be showing you something interesting because there's a burning topic that I want to bring, and two of my new courses launched on LinkedIn Learning that gives you the answer for that. And then at 9:30 we have a speaker, Katrina Ingram, who's going to be joining us. And I will pass it on back to Deepika to host it and join you in asking questions. So uh, we have covered a lot of topics about Gen AI, a lot about LLMs, and Agent AI. Many of you taken my courses on those topics also. And as you are building this, the way I'm seeing it as a technology futurist, I'm looking at what is happening in the tech space. There's a lot of posturing, lot of competition that creates new technologies. And so I'm always looking at what is viable, what is here to stay. And my measure of that is if the technology is here to stay, then it is going to create value for the customers and it is going to create more jobs. And so if it's impacting real jobs, not just that some VC funded it and now there's some, 100 new jobs, but it systematically increases jobs, sustainable way that, that's how I'm looking at, technologies that are here to stay. Otherwise, in technologies come and go, and then there's a wave and then things change, right? So based on that, if you think about what we are doing with LLMs, people are saying we are doing chatbots. We don't do chatbots for everything. We cannot. It could be that chatbot could have become the UI interface for any backend technology by integrating into the backend. So initially LLMs came, Gen AI came, LLMs came. LLMs took on, went into a multimodal form so that you can interact with voice, with chatting, all kinds of generation of different modes was all baked into the same model, starting from Gemini and GPT-4. And then when you start building that, the big challenge is there's a lot of data because it's taking data and then it is drawing insights from data. It is, and so RAG evolved. But then people started feeling there's too many data sources, and this is sitting in a SAP system, or this is sitting in an Oracle system, and I'm bringing this in a PDF form. And how do we desperate data sources inside enterprise has been a perpetual problem for decades. And there have been companies that have come, startups that have come to just do that. So for those of you who are here, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. It's not going to be streamed. And you will learn so much from each other, not just from me or the other speaker. So make sure that you're comfortable to connect with others. And we have a Slack channel, and you can join the Slack. I believe we send the Slack when we send the reminder with the Zoom link for this weekly wed. So feel free to chat there. I see some people like Mala who are very active there, and I come and share some jobs. I have posted out some opportunities when people ask me for stuff. There's a book review stuff that somebody is giving me a book on AI for product managers from Irene Brastis. And I just thought I could get one of my students to do that. Can you give us a copy? So I can't post the book copy, but that's distribution. But if somebody is interested, you can just ping me on the Slack at the AI Learners. And I think I posted an autonomous vehicle clip also back in the Slack before I posted the new one online last night. Okay, so I was talking about data, multiple data sources. How many of you face that problem? Show of hands, or just tell me, is that something that you are seeing? That here you can feed a data source and you can get the LLM to do RAG and integrate. Say, think of Amazon has Rufus as a chatbot, right? Saying that I will help you. But Rufus cannot help us if it is not connected to the existing traditional AI, all the collaborative filtering that already exists in Amazon over decades. So they did the integration. So everybody was focused on integrations into multiple other systems, right? When we started with LLM. Then they said, let's do RAG with data sources. So we cannot just take or they do fine tuning with a new data set, right? So that cannot be just creating new data. What happens to the existing customer, say data, behavior data, or do you have customer churn data analysis that somebody did in a different department? Or you have like sales data, or you have employee data in HR system. All of that are in different system, and they are very secure, and they have access control. Especially in enterprise, what happens is you don't have access to everything. I used to work in mobile analytics, heading mobile analytics at eBay in my last corporate job almost 8 years back. And one of the first thing we did when anybody got onboarded in the company was we would say, hey, what level of what's the job you're doing, what kind of systems do you need access to, and then as a manager I had to approve that this person needs access to these systems, and that's the only system they could do that they could access. And then if they had to run a query that had to touch a different system, then we had to escalate and go get access. So there was strict access control. That's how we protected customer data, and that's a thing that happens in all enterprise. So, can you think of what kind of data that you might be running into or you have seen in your companies that you will be using? Now, when you think of using LLM, forget LLM for a minute. What kind of data source do you use in a company when you're saying, okay, I'm going to build some system, I'm going to build some product? Give me an example of some kind of data that you will be using. I do like quizzes. You know that, right? Those of you who show up, I know only a small set of you show up here, the brave souls here on Zoom, but you're coming for my quiz. Give me an example, guys. Give me an example. Write it in the chat. Let me see. Okay. Oh, BizOps data. That's a very good one. Thank you. SharePoint or Confluence. Yes. So, yeah, your data might be sitting. What kind of data might be in SharePoint?
Company related, like holidays,
Your calendar for the company.
calendar, and standards, procedures, and things like that, maybe.
Oh, right. Okay. Thank you. And I'm seeing one more customer data, website data, product usage data is a very good one. I remember, if you're doing analytics, we are actually looking at data. And then we used to have some data which was like a real-time stream of customer data. As soon as the customer comes to the site, where they are coming from, the traffic sources will be seen only by marketing, and then they would navigate through the site, and in real time we would have a Hadoop system. But then it will all go into some Teradata, and then analytics would have access to it, and then we would draw insights from that. And that job is now being done by AI, or even the people who were running analytics departments have kind of started using AI as a complement. PRDs, engineering design, yes, those are like intellectual property of the company, so everybody would not have access to engineering design, so those would be protected. Now if you want an LLM to look at that and see what compare it and see whether there is a flaw, or see if there is a learning compared to previous years, you could do that, but then you have to feed this data. So one of the companies that has been in this space is called Data Stacks. It's a startup that's evolved, and just recently they announced they're going to be acquired by IBM. So a lot of this data is also sitting in the cloud. So there's like cloud technologies that is going to, like, if you might have SharePoint, then you might have the information in a Microsoft cloud. Then there might be an Azure system that gives you access to that. Or if this is a Google Cloud, there might be Google Cloud API. But with the LLM world, Google gives Gemini API. So if you're, or there could be a third party software like DataStax. So Sneha Jadhav was talking to me the other day about using DataStax. And was asking me how does it compare to NotebookLM. So I want to quickly share my screen and show you where I'm going to give you access, because I don't want to be talking to you about new courses and then you can't try it if your company is not, paid for it. So here's my newsletter, bit.ly/Jamthin newsletter, for those of you who are already not part of it. And by the way, this is March, and it's International Women's History Month. So happy Women's History Month. And then by Saturday, it is International Women's Day. So I'm going to bring you amazing women explaining topics in 2 minutes called Women's Planning. So the two courses that I was talking to you. So on my LinkedIn Learning, two courses have dropped just on Monday. One is called Notebook LM, other is called Glean AI. And if you click each of these images, you will get access to both the courses one at a time. And I believe the Notebook LM is about 40 minutes and Glean AI is about 20 minutes or 25 minutes, I believe. Okay, so you should be able to, if your company has access to LinkedIn Learning, you'll be able to go in and, Stanford has it, a lot of large companies have it. But if you don't have access, you can just click get a free link, because as an author of the course, I've made that free for you. You can take the whole course. Okay. The other thing I want to tell you is we have a lineup of speakers that we've shared for the whole month, so you can plan ahead. I think one of the last speakers from 26 is not included in the list. So shall I quickly show you the Notebook LM interface, guys? Yeah?
Yeah, Sudha.
Okay. Let me share. This is the Notebook LM screen. So what we have talked about Notebook LM. Does somebody want to tell me what does Notebook LM do? And Suresh is doing a shout out. If you want to be in the video recording, you can speak. Otherwise, you can chat, guys. Okay. Let me close this window. Okay. So I believe. So basically, so what does Notebook LM do? Does anybody remember from having seen that from me before? I think I did that in Sudha Live while I was preparing for my course. Wouldn't it be wonderful if AI could take your documents and videos and build your customer presentations and even an audio podcast in just a few minutes? Enter Notebook LM. Notebook LM is a tool that can glean insight from your documents. And on top of that, you can chat with your document or generate an audio podcast. How cool is that? Okay, I'm going to stop here. So essentially, you can take any kind of documents, you can take videos. So somebody was asking at our Slack about a past weekly wed recording. So if you go to our YouTube, you will find the weekly wed playlist, and you'll have a lot of past recording. Only in recent times, LM has started taking them and making into small clips that he shares on LinkedIn with you. But you can take any of the past videos, and then you can actually get a whole insight, right? You can basically get a transcript, which is easy one. You can do that even with Gemini. But then what if you can get a whole study guide out of it? So many of you ask me, what about this course about autonomous vehicle? What about this course about, do you have material on this topic or that topic? Yes, podcast. So the other thing, one of the things it does is it can, I believe with Gemini, you can even generate audio. So Gemini API is the backend for it, and this is a complete no-code, yeah, easy interface that they've created. But what you can do is it can actually, if you see one of the interesting things I was talking about, corporate data is extracting insights from a document. So you can input a PDF, and then it'll give you a whole study guide or insights, or it will draw insights and it'll say, okay, ready, now talk to me. So you can chat with the document. And the other thing is the audio podcast. So it can actually generate a whole audio podcast. So here in my demo, I have something fun.
I showed you in a previous demo how to take a document and build a study guide and talk to it, even chat with it. And I used my generative AI primer for product business managers book in a PDF form. So what I'm going to show you here is even more exciting. We are going to take this book and we are going to generate an audio podcast.
So this podcast is like two people talking to each other. Typically, they have a male voice and a female voice talking, and it generates as if they have gleaned the insights from the book, and they're discussing it as if they are on a podcast. And this was completely generated. And one of the exercises here is to generate a podcast. So you could do that for sales. If you're going to go present your company to somebody, you could do that with your resume if you want to generate a podcast and say, about, say, Mala, and what is her background. It's amazing where she's come from, what kind of things she can do. And then you can have, like, two AI voice clones talk about you.
Using Notebook LM.
Okay.
So we already input this file. If you're getting started afresh, you have to upload the document. In this case, I've uploaded the document. And you don't need to build a study guide. You don't need to do any other prep. In here, I've actually done this. So I'm going to show you because it takes a little time for it to generate the audio. You will see a button which says generate audio, and I clicked it. And voila, it generated an audio podcast. Let me show you what it sounds like. So this is actually Notebook LM creating a whole new podcast.
I'm sorry, guys.
Two people
I
talking
said the same
to each
thing.
other
Yeah.
in audio, completely based on the data source, in this case, the generative AI book that I've inputted. Amazing. Are you excited to hear what it says?
All right, so we've got a pretty hefty stack of stuff on generative AI here.
Yeah,
Research papers, tech breakdowns,
it is a lot.
even a textbook.
Yeah.
You're serious about this, huh? You want to go deeper than just asking a chatbot to like write a limerick?
Definitely. And what really struck me is how much of this material, it goes way beyond, just that wow factor
Yeah.
of AI generated content. It's like we're seeing the tip of the iceberg.
Mhm.
And these sources are all about what's going on beneath the surface.
So not just a limerick, but like reshaping how we even experience information itself.
Exactly. Fundamental shifts.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Okay, I'm going to stop that. So you get the idea. So you can do that, generate a podcast. Ananya, you might want to try that, or draw insights. And then it's not just one document. You can input a bunch of different documents, and you should be able to do that. And video insights is the one. I want to do a project with you guys with WeeklyWed. You can input a document, you can input a URL, and it can get you the insights and give you a study guide from, say, one of our past WeeklyWed speakers, right? And we could select a bunch of those and do that too. And then Deepika here works with me on my courses and make sure that I just don't get too excited about Gen AI and we go burn trees and and it's loaded with hallucination and bias. She makes sure that I'm thinking about ethical consideration and mitigation techniques for hallucination and data privacy and the like. And that has become very, very important because we are focused on responsible AI these days. Everyone wants to do responsible AI. Okay, so with that, I'm going to stop. And similarly, there is the other course called Glean AI. And Glean AI does something slightly different because this is not just give me input on and let me generate a fun podcast or video insights, but this is set up by your IT department with lot of your different documents with that access control I was talking to you earlier, and then you will be able to generate the chat, talk, and all that good stuff. So I've given access to both of that in the newsletter. So try it out. Come talk to me in the chat. And if you're trying to do something in your company, like if you're using data stacks and doing this is all going to be no code, so you can learn it fast. But if you're doing this programmatically in a company, you might want to end up using Gemini API, or data stacks is being bought by IBM, so it's going to become part of Watson. So this is where this is going. So I believe this is one of the big trends where LLM is actually, creating value for the enterprise only when it connects to corporate data sets, respecting the access control and all that stuff. It sounds like a lot of words, but if you play with it and try to do something, think of the use cases. That'll be fun discussion we can have in the Slack later, guys. Or you can actually, share it at LinkedIn also if you're interested at Business School of AI. I'll come check that also. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. Unless somebody has a burning question, I'm going to hand it over to Katrina, our speaker for the second half, who's got an exciting topic to share.
Well, thanks so much for the invite here. It sounds like you're having a fantastic discussion about Notebook. I'm sorry I missed out on that. Let me just take a minute here and get my screen.
Yeah, no problem at all. I'm just wrapping up. Okay,
right.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm just going to give a minute for Katrina Ingram, and we are going to get started. Yeah, and as we are talking about data and we are talking about AI, the most important thing is, to do this ethically. And we've had Diavin come in and talk about how she's built the responsible AI practice in Amazon AWS and how they are not calling it AI ethics and they are calling it responsible AI. And I had a whole session about what's the difference between the two. So I'm going to pass it on to Katrina Ingram to talk about bias, fairness, and justice. And Katrina has done so much in the AI ethics space. She has a whole course. Katrina, before you share, if you would like to introduce yourself, I think you can do better justice.
You bet. Yeah.
Because you've done a lot more. Yeah.
Thanks so much for the invite to be here with you on Weekly Wednesday. So I'm Katrina Ingram. I run a social enterprise out of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada called Ethically Aligned AI. And I've been working in this space since 2018. So I started out, this was actually a bit of a career pivot for me. I started out by going back to school. I did a bunch of research on this whole topic of applied ethics for AI. And then I wound up launching a company as a result of that. So I work with a lot of different organizations on this topic. I do a lot of training courses and give a lot of talks because there's a lot of awareness that we still need to build about what's going on when it comes to AI and how it might go off the rails. So today, what I'm going to do a deep dive into this issue of bias, fairness, and justice. And I'm going to take this at maybe a different angle than what you're used to. I'm going to be a little non-technical for the first half of the presentation. I'm going to talk a bit more about the philosophical underpinnings of these notions of bias and fairness and justice. And then we're going to take it into the realm of AI. So that's kind of where we're going. I'll be about 30 minutes, and I'm happy to answer some questions afterwards. So
that's great. I'm just going to go mute myself. I just wanted to hand it over to Deepika Sarkar, who's our usual host, and she'll be fielding questions. So feel free to answer your question, ask questions in the chat if you don't want to be in the recording, guys. Okay.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. All right, so let's start out kind of big picture here. We can think about the world as it is. And the world as it is, maybe it's not the most fair of places, but that is sort of the reality that we live within. And then there's this idea of the world as it should be, the world as it could be. How do we get to a better place? And I think this kind of notion of dealing with the world as it is versus the world as it could or should be is really important when we start to think about bias and fairness and justice. I also want to kind of call out the idea of the world as it should be. People come at that from different perspectives. People don't always agree on what that world as it should be is going. And so I think that's another important thing to consider as we talk about these issues. So a lot of our notions of what is fair and what is just in a Western context come from philosophical thinkers, and some of these trace quite far back in history. So this is a quote from Aristotle: "Equals should be treated equally and unequals unequally." Well, that's easy enough for Aristotle to say, but what does that actually mean? And when we get into the nitty gritty of how we think about that, that's, I think, where we start to encounter some of these issues around what is, what is biased, what is unfair, and maybe what is unjust as well. And so this has deep roots. I also want to call out, I'm coming at this a bit from a Western philosophical perspective. It's not the only perspective. And in fact, I think that in itself is a bit of a bias. But it's important to understand this because it sort of relates to a lot of the laws that we have in a Western context. All right, so let's do a little thought experiment here. You can kind of silently answer in your mind, or if you want to get in the chat and to have some conversation about this. But let's say you've got $1 and you've got to put that dollar towards a child's education. There's 3 kids in this scenario. What is the fairest way to distribute that dollar? Well, one way that you might do it is you might say you get 33.33 cents and you get 33.33 cents, and everybody gets kind of an equal amount. So this idea, we divide up the dollar, everybody gets the equal amount. So we're kind of going for this notion of equality. Or you might say, look, who is the kid who actually needs this dollar the most? Who am I going to help the most? And who's the most financially in need? You're going to get my dollar. And that's kind of going for this notion of equity. I'm going to kind of level the playing field a little bit with my dollar. Now, you might say, look, I'm going to take a different approach. What I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line in the sand. And in this case, it's going to be academic achievement. I'm going to say whoever the kid is with the highest test score, they're going to get my dollar. And that's going to be fair because I've applied the same procedure to make that decision. So there's this notion of procedural fairness. And so that kid's going to get the dollar. And then the last one is, hey, maybe more information. One of these kids is your kids, and you're going to give the dollar to your child because it's your child. Now, that last choice is actually biased, but I would ask you, is it unfair? And I would say in our society, probably not. People would say, hey, that's okay. You're there to support your child. Somebody else can support their child. That's kind of okay. And the reason I wanted to show you this example is that bias isn't always connected to unfairness. But where I think it becomes a problem, or why I think we care about it, is when it does connect to something that is perceived as being unfair. So I wanted to kind of call that out for you with this thought experiment. Let's do one more thought experiment. This time, you are a hiring manager at a company and you've got one job to offer. So you can't take that job and cut it up into the little pieces. You can't do the same thing that you did with the dollar. So instead, this notion of what is actually equality gets reframed as equal opportunity. And in this case, the way that kind of plays out is that we're going to remove all of these things that might be perceived as disadvantaging a person that are perhaps protected characteristics, things that people can't really control. They don't even really relate to the job. I'm talking about things like gender and age and race and those kinds of things. And there's actually a legal basis for that as well, protected categories of data. So we're going to do that. We're going to remove all that, and then we make our decision, and we've given equal opportunity. So that might be one way of looking at this. In another scenario, let's say you just say, you know what, my friend's getting that job. I'm going to just, I'm not going to do a job posting, not going to consider anyone. I'm just going to give the job to my friend. And you could say, yeah, this is unfair, right? It's kind of unfair, kind of unethical, but it's maybe not illegal. And I think we probably all have stories about where something like this has happened, right? Somebody knows someone and the job doesn't really get posted and the friend gets the job. So there's an unfairness there, but maybe it's not quite meeting that category of being illegal. And then the last thing to consider is this idea of, is it enough to remove the so-called disadvantages, to try and level the playing field by just removing those things? Is that enough? Or do we actually need to do more, something positive, to help historically marginalized groups, disadvantaged groups? And I think this has always been a politically charged question. I will say right now, it's probably the most politically charged I've seen it in a really long time, right? And so, but I think it's a legitimate question to continue to ask, especially as we're kind of trying to get to that world as it could or should be ideal. And so those are some things to consider. So I just want to kind of call this out. I've been talking about this, but I want to just make it explicit. I think that we care about bias because we actually care about fairness. I think that's really what we're striving for. And I think we care about fairness because we actually care about justice. So I think that justice to me is sort of at the core of what we're trying to achieve here. Now, this isn't easy to do because this notion of fairness, as I've tried to explain a little bit from these thought experiments, is really dependent on context. And sometimes we treat people the same and we say that's fair. And sometimes we treat people differently because we're trying to correct for something and we say that's fair. And so that we get at this notion of disparate treatment, different treatment versus disparate impacts. And this little cartoon, I think, illustrates this kind of well. So if you think about everybody's equal, hey, everybody gets a box, but look at what happens. We've got someone who didn't need the box, someone who's using the box and still isn't getting their needs met, and another person's like, what the heck am I supposed to do with this box? And then we can look at the other side of the equation and think about the idea of giving people what they need, which might be different things, right? Maybe someone doesn't actually need that resource. Maybe someone needs a lot more of the resource, and maybe someone needs a different resource. But what we're looking for is the outcome. That's what we're really concerned about. And these notions of fair might be applicable. In fact, they are applicable in different contexts in society, but they're different notions of fairness. So where do these kinds of notions come from? I want to give you a little bit of information about two philosophers. I will caveat this by saying I'm highly reducing their huge body of work to literally one slide for the interest of time today. But the first is John Rawls. So Rawls has written a lot about these ideas, and he's really a justice as fairness who's striving for this idea of equity. So you could say he's kind of pursuing this world as it should or could be kind of objective. And he does his own thought experiment. He says, look, if everybody was behind this veil of ignorance and we didn't know if we're going to be billionaires or the most disadvantaged person in society, we didn't know our station, then what we would want to do is make sure that just in case we wind up in that disadvantaged group, we're going to make sure that group is treated really fairly. And this kind of notion really underpins a lot of our liberal democracy. We see this in our laws. And it relates to this idea of distributive justice. So this idea of the fairness of allocating resources. So down the hall from John Rawls at Harvard University was another philosopher named Robert Nozick. And Robert Nozick had a bit of a different take on things. And he basically said, look, the world is an unfair place. You could say he's a world as it is kind of a guy. And, it doesn't matter what we do to try and adjust things. It's always going to be unfair. So the most fair thing we can do is just apply this notion of procedural fairness. We'll just have a fair process. There's no deception, no manipulation. There's kind of minimal intervention. He's kind of a bit of a libertarian type thinker. And he thinks that's the most fair thing. And so the reason he has this kind of famous example that explains it involving an athlete, but I'm going to use Taylor Swift as my example. So the reason he says is, look, you can adjust the world and try and make it fair and equitable, but along is going to come a Taylor Swift, they're a superstar, and they're going to be, that much more popular, earn more money, etc. And this is going to happen all the time. So stop even trying to make things, equitable. We'll just go with this idea of procedural fairness. Again, I'm highly summarizing his position, but that's kind of what it comes down to. And so again, we have these two notions of fairness, procedural fairness, which is all about the process. And we apply this all the time. I do this when I grade student papers, and I give some people an A and some people a B, but I use the same rubric. I apply the same rules. I'm transparent about what I'm looking for. So there's a fairness in my process. But you might also consider this idea of distributive justice. And this is the idea, again, that we're going to treat different people differently to kind of level the playing field. And there's a lot of instances of where we might want to advantage women in some way or help advance women by having special programs like women on boards or women in STEM, because when we look at the outcomes, they're kind of dismal, right? There's a huge inequality. So we're kind of trying to correct for something. This is the world as it should be. And so again, we use these all the time in our world right now, and it's often really dependent on the context in terms of how we apply them. All right, so that's a whole lot about fairness and bias and justice. Let's take this into the world of the algorithmic. Let's talk a little bit about how this works in an AI sense. So the first thing I want to do is give a nod to a paper that's been around for quite a while now, written back in 1996 by two scholars, Batya Friedman and Helen Nissenbaum. And Friedman and Nissenbaum, they call out this idea of bias in computer systems. And I think a lot of what they're saying still applies today in terms of AI and algorithmic systems. And they talk about different ways that biases emerge. So they say there's this pre-existing bias, and it's kind of this societal bias that comes into the technology. And we can think about that in terms of algorithms as data bias, for example. Then there's this technical bias, and it arises from how we use the technology. Now, back in their day, search engine optimization and things like Google search were brand new technologies. And so they use that as their example, and they say, look, you do a search, you look at the first two pages, and you don't look at page 3, 4, et cetera. And so there's kind of a bias in terms of how the technology works and what actually gets displayed in the technology. And I would say this is even more exacerbated with our AI summaries, right? Like some people only go to the AI summary. And then there's this next category called emergent bias. And emergent bias is a little more subtle in that it takes a little bit more of the context into play. And so what they say is, look, if you're on the third or fourth ranking, let's say you don't do SEO very well, you haven't really optimized, then your business never gets seen, maybe your business goes bankrupt, all of these kinds of things happen as a result of you being left out. And so that's kind of this idea of emergent biases and how that plays into the technology. All right, now I'm going to show you a very short video. This is from a course that I developed. As I mentioned, I develop a lot of courses, and this really kind of unpacks this idea of how do biases emerge in data and AI systems. So we're going to take a look at this, and then I'm going to talk a bit more about some specific examples of how this works. I did check the box for sound, but if there's any technical issues that go on and you can't hear or whatever, let me know. All right, here we go.
We've all heard the saying, numbers don't lie, but the truth is that data and statistical analysis aren't always as objective as we might hope. Biases may be introduced at different stages of data management, collection, and processing. When biases are encoded in AI training or testing data, it can have serious implications for fairness and justice. One common source of data bias is sample bias. It happens when the composition or demographics of a dataset do not reflect the real-world population. Certain types of people or things might be overrepresented in the data. Others might be underrepresented. This can result in unequal outcomes when an AI model is deployed. For example, consider a machine learning model that is designed to evaluate candidates during video-recorded job interviews. If light-skinned people are overrepresented in the training data, the model might struggle to recognize or read the faces of dark-skinned candidates. This could harm their chances of getting the job. Another potential issue is historical bias. Data that was collected in the past does not always reflect current realities or future goals. Using that data to train algorithms can cause them to reproduce historical inequalities. For example, maybe developers want to train an algorithm to assess heart attack risk. They might use health system data from people who have been diagnosed with a heart attack in the past. Unfortunately, heart attacks have historically been underdiagnosed in women. The algorithm may learn to reproduce that discriminatory, life-threatening pattern. How developers define the problem that an algorithm aims to solve can also lead to biased outputs. This is known as framing bias. For instance, imagine that a credit card company wants to use AI to predict customers' creditworthiness. The developers must first define creditworthiness in a way that an algorithm can estimate or predict. Does the company want to maximize the number of loans that get repaid, or does it want to maximize its profits? The developer's goals will determine how they define creditworthiness and how the algorithm learns to predict it. If the company defines creditworthiness in terms of profit maximization, the algorithm might discover that giving subprime loans is an effective way to drive profits. This could lead to predatory lending that disadvantages low-income borrowers. To build AI systems that are reliable and fair, developers must take steps to limit these biases and others.
All right, so there's a lot going on there, a lot of things relating to the data, the inputs that we're using to build these algorithmic models, but also what are we optimizing for in that creditworthiness example? That matters as well. So I want to walk you through a couple of other examples that relate to this. And the first is involves Amazon. So this is a rather famous case of gender bias in hiring. So what Amazon was trying to do is trying to build an AI model, wanted to streamline its hiring, be more efficient, hire people that were going to be successful at the company. But what it did is it fell prey a little bit to sampling and historical bias. So it used a training data set that was mostly male. And part of this was, it was a technical role where they'd hired a lot of men for this, and they kind of looked to that as their version of success. So there was a little bit of that. But also in society, as I was saying, some of these STEM programs still don't have a great representation of women. So there was kind of this bigger social sort of situation as well. Anyways, the algorithm learned that women were not likely to be successful. So they're going to screen out anything that looks like it might be female in terms of the data. And of course, this is based on correlations. It's based on proxies, and it's subtle. It's not just, because you don't put on your resume necessarily like I am female. It's things like, what school did you attend? What sports are you playing? What the language choices? All of this gets assessed, and these correlations are made. And so they weren't able to fix it because it was so complicated and entangled that they couldn't fix it. They wound up scrapping the project. And of course, there was a big media story written about this. If you're interested in other examples of AI in the hiring context, this book, The Algorithm by Hilke Schellman. I highly recommend it. I think it's a great resource for these kinds of stories. So that's the story of Amazon. I want to just call out one thing, like what was going on here. This idea of putting people in categories is really important to how AI systems work. And it's all based on these patterns that it learns in the data. And so in this case, good candidate correlated very highly with these male patterns. Poor candidate correlated really highly with these female patterns. And it sort of put these people in categories. So this is really important to know when you kind of think about ideas around bias and fairness and how are we actually going to correct for these things down the road. All right. I want to take a bit of a U-turn. You're probably looking at the slide going, what the heck, where are we going with this? And so I promise you, I'm going to connect this back to another example. But first, I want to call out this idea of false negatives and positives. And as I was building this particular slide deck for today, I was sort of thinking, what's a way to do this that maybe people can relate to? And I was thinking about this idea of a test. And in this case, it's a pregnancy test. So you might say, okay, so let's say the actual condition, this is you are pregnant or you're not pregnant, kind of two different versions here. But you take a test, and the test, as you know, is always a prediction, right? It's got an error rate. It's not 100% guarantee of knowing if you're pregnant or not. There's always some kind of an error rate. And so let's say that you're actually not pregnant, but the test says you are. We call that a false positive. But let's say that you actually are pregnant and the test says you're not, we call that a false negative. And then of course we have true negatives and true positives where the two things line up. So the reason I'm showing you this is because I want to talk about another case that it's not involving pregnancy at all. It's involving criminals and whether they're going to reoffend. And so this kind of question was asked in the context of criminals. Is this person who committed this crime, are they going to reoffend? And so we have this piece of software that's going to do this kind of prediction. Yes, they're going to reoffend. No, they're going to not reoffend. And again, it's based on this prevalence of the prediction having some level of error rate. But here's the challenge or the problem that we have is we don't actually know the actual condition. Like we might know after the fact if we let them out and then they actually do reoffend, but it's kind of too late, right? So what this company that was building this algorithm, the software model did is said, you know what we're going to do? First of all, before we even apply this, we're going to say, are you low risk? Are you high risk? Kind of like what Amazon was doing with the good candidate, poor candidate sort of sorting mechanism. So I want to pull all of these two things together. Sorry, this is, I just kind of repeated low risk, high risk. What happened was more white people were kind of put in the low risk camp, and more Black people were put in the high risk camp. And this really underpins the story of Compass. So some of you might have heard of Compass. This is a rather famous case that was written about by ProPublica in 2016. So they got a hold of some of this data for this algorithm that was used in recidivism, which is kind of this reoffend, are you going to reoffend question used in the judicial system. And what they found is that Black people were twice as likely to be put in that high risk category than white people. So you can imagine, you probably don't want to be mistakenly put in the high risk category, because if you're in the high risk category, guess what? You're probably not going to get parole. Now, North Point, who's changed their name to Equivant, but this is the company that makes the software, what they said is, look, once we put you in a category, we treat you equally. So that's the kind of that false positive, false negative. So they said it's more about being treated equally once you're in a category than it is about the category. So they kind of argued this other definition of fairness. And then some other researchers came along and they said, look, these two things cannot be compatible mathematically. And there's a great piece by MIT Technology Review that has an interactive kind of slider that you can play with. So you can try and get these things to balance out and be equal. You won't be able to, because they're not mathematically compatible. And so you can go and play around with that if you're interested. But basically, this is known as the group fairness impossibility theorem. And it basically says that when you're trying to go for this version of fairness, you can't also satisfy this version of fairness mathematically. And so you need to then kind of figure out what you're trying to aim for. And it speaks to this idea of the different kinds of fairness that we have in the world. Of course, it's never as simple as saying, hey, well, we're just not going to look at race either, kind of the same, similar to Amazon, not really looking at gender, because there's so many correlations for this. And so that really is the problem. This is from the work of Arvind Narayanan. He's done a lot of work in this area, fair machine learning, written a great book called AI Snake Oil. He's someone that if you're interested in this area of fairness and how to maybe get at better, more fair systems, I would recommend checking out his work as well. One more thing I want to show you is somebody who is trying to aim for equity. And they're trying to do that with hiring systems in particular. So again, this is theoretical research more so than an actual product. But basically, let's assume that what we're going for is equity. So equity is that idea that we're going to treat different people differently in order to get to that better outcome. Juliana Stoyanovich has spent quite a bit of time thinking about this, and she has something called this diverse balanced ranking. And I don't have time to get too much into the weeds around this, but essentially it's this idea that we're going to treat different people differently. But the problem becomes, I guess there's a couple of problems with this. One is this idea of, is this algorithmic affirmative action? Can we actually even do that? And so it raises this sort of legal question around using the protected categories, even though she wants to use that information to help make things better for people. Can we even do that? And then what are the variables that we're going to use? And then who's going to decide what's fair? So there's a whole bunch of questions that come up as a result of rethinking around equity, let's say, for an AI system. But I think it's interesting work that she's doing. And again, if you're if hiring an AI algorithms is of interest to you, she's definitely a person to check out. So kind of going back to this idea, we have different notions, often competing and incompatible notions of what is fair in society. And then we layer on AI and we think it's going to solve that problem. It doesn't. It makes it worse in some cases. And so I think we need to acknowledge that. I also wanted to just call out this idea of what is mathematically convenient. And I'm not going to go into explaining each of these different fairness metrics, but these are some of the common ones that come up, demographic parity, or we equalizing odds, is it equal opportunity? These are all able to be computed. But I just want to challenge this notion a bit and say sometimes there might be things that are not as convenient to be computed. And so even as we try and attempt to make things better mathematically in the algorithm, we may still be missing something that's important to this notion of fairness, which is, again, very much tied to context. So in terms of how do we do better, this is from a lot of the fair machine learning literature. There's a site called fairlearn.org. which has been helpful in kind of putting together a process, let's say. And what I like is this idea of starting with the people. So recentering it, it's not about starting with the algorithm or the model, it's starting with the people, recentering around this idea of harms and impacts. So who might be harmed? What is the impact? And then doing a disaggregated analysis to really take a look at that. There's a lot just even involved in that one step. And then there's this notion of the data. How do we get better data? It's not always obvious what better data means. I think there's a lot of questions, again, going back to the context, what exactly does that look like? Then we can think about training the model. We could add fairness constraints. There's a whole bunch of literature around that in the fair ML world. But one of the things that I think is really important is really being explicit about what we mean by fair. And that's why I spent a lot of time in the first half of this presentation unpacking this idea of fairness. Because if we don't call that out, if we obscure that, we get into a compass situation, right? Where one group's like, this is how we define fairness. And another group says, well, that still seems quite unfair. And then there's post hoc techniques that we can apply, whether that's technical constraints, more kinds of filters and that sort of thing, or maybe we just temper our expectations around what we're doing here and how we're going to use this information and what is it good for. So that's kind of the non-technical side of things. So the big challenge, and this is from Michael Kern's work, he's done a lot of work in this area as well. He said, look, we can't have it all. We need to decide what are we trading off. And sometimes when you trade off for fairness, maybe you have a less accurate model. Maybe there's other things that are being impacted like privacy. So he says there's not going to be one model that can do everything. And then I also wanted to layer in this idea of other cultures, other perspectives that are non-Western. And when we layer those on, we get into an infinitely more complex kind of a situation as well. It's already complicated, but we just make it even more complicated. And so essentially, to kind of sum things up, I think humans will base fairness on context. That's what I was trying to get at with some of our thought experiments, how we actually think about what is fair in different situations in the world. And ultimately, I think organizations that are using these algorithmic systems are going to need to be transparent and accountable for whatever version of fairness they decide to adopt and to really be accountable for those choices. So that is the talk. I see there's a ton going on in chat. Sorry I wasn't able to get to it as I was going through, but now I'd love to do some Q&A with you. I'll also mention you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to stay connected with you. I blog a lot at my website, ethicallyalignedai.com. And then, of course, I do build courses as well. But let me stop sharing so I can take a look at you, and I'm happy to answer some questions, and maybe I'll throw to Jebika to help me with responding to those questions.
Yeah, that was amazing. I really liked your subprime mortgage example. I just thought that was a perfect, I think oftentimes when we talk about fairness in AI, especially fairness within training data, we're always just looking at it in like a social justice lens. And we forget, not that we forget, those of us who understand it know that it permeates to all other parts of society. But I think people forget, right, that like this is not just like a niche corner of caring about fairness in society. This fully affects everyone in every aspect to the point of like credit ratings, right? And like, so I really, really love that example. There's so many books on this that I could think of that I like, that you mentioned some that I would love for all of it, for you to even come back and talk about that. So yeah, so we have a question, Sudha. I see that you're on the screen, but I did see your question. And Sudha asked, in reality, when you use a fairness metric, does it not take away from someone else who would have benefited? How are teams building AI dealing with this? Because people will bring their bias in the name of sense of fairness.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And there's so many different levels to this. So how are teams dealing with it? I think, we're at the early days of a lot of this, I feel, and people are still trying to sort out what does that mean in the context of their work. So I think about it as addressing it in terms of layers. So one layer could be the training. So training the team, helping people understand what their implicit biases might be, what their perspective is, that they're coming to the table, making sure you have a diverse team, so you're getting lots of different perspectives. That's really important as well. And you're not all thinking in the same way. So those kinds of things I think are really important. And then diving into maybe more of the technical decisions around the fair ML literature, that's where there are like specific, and I would say that's not really my level of expertise as someone who isn't really a data scientist, but for people who are, or machine learning engineer, people who are building the technology, really kind of understanding what are the technical trade-offs that are making here and how are those impacting the fairness that we've agreed on. And I think that's part of it, is agreeing on like, what are we going for, and then standing behind that. And that can be hard, right? Because you get called out on something the way North Point did with Compass, and people agree that, oh, maybe that wasn't so fair what you did, then maybe you need to kind of rethink what you're doing.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. Like I think for me, like I want what I really hope in terms of your topic, I want companies to start showing like in terms of their, analytics, in terms of their investment and their return on investment, how ignoring this data that's readily available about bias, like for example, when they're using male only training data, how it affects their sales, like for example, I think of cars and how when we build them, we use male test dummies in the driving seat, and we've always designed cars with men as the default in mind, and that's us as like, or these companies fully ignoring readily available data of women who end up buying more cars, in particular SUVs, and end up completely left out of the training itself, but end up becoming the largest data because, they're the ones who are using it the most. And so, and that I think of fairness, I think of that's like one of the something that an organization like a Compass, like any other company that just has ignored this data and they've just used traditional training. And I don't necessarily think the people who are even using the data are biased per se. It's just that's the data that was available. They didn't think much into it, so they just started using it, and then it ends up creating an unfair situation. So I feel like everything you've been talking about, I keep thinking of all these other industries that it's affecting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important. I mean, every one of us, regardless of who we are, we all have these implicit biases. So when I talk to data scientists, I try and, assure them it's not that you are uniquely biased in any way or unethical or anything like that. It's just that these choices of, say, convenience, this is the data we could get, or we told management we need better data and they said, no, we have no budget, so go and use that data. There's a whole bunch of reasons why things wind up the way they are that are complicated. And I think when we do the analysis, we need to kind of unpack those things. But the more that we tell these stories and have these conversations, and I think more people inside companies who are building things start asking them in their own context, and maybe can change things for their own organization.
Yeah, what I wonder is like if, especially since this is your expertise, like what would you say for a company is like a great recommendation to now how to still focus on this, even though there are so many organizations now without even, being directed to just moving away from DEI. Like private organizations are moving away from diversity, equity, and inclusion, even though it was a federal mandate for federal organizations, right? Like a private company doesn't have to, but they're still doing it anyway. So it's like, how do you still recommend focusing on the data that people are using and how the fairness that goes into it? How do you still help a company stay on that topic, even though the general public is talking about moving away from it?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I think you need to do is de-escalate the emotionally charged kind of piece of it, which can be hard, right? Because it is a topic that I feel very passionate about. It's kind of why I started where I started, which is the world as it is and the world as it should be, right? Because when you start to unpack these perspectives and see these different philosophers who worked on different versions, you can start to see, where do people get their worldview? Like, who are they leaning into? And I use Nozick and Rawls very purposefully because to me, they're kind of two ends of a spectrum here. And there's a lot in between, whole lot in between, right? And so I think part of it for me is sort of unpacking this idea around that. But you can also then sort of take that into a data perspective.
Mhm.
You can talk about, like, don't you want to make the best product possible? Like, don't you want to be the most, have the most fair and yeah, because I think people do sort of care about the ideas of fairness. It's just that they have different perceptions of what that might be, right? And so I think when you start to illustrate, first of all, that there are different ideas, but also how do we do the best we possibly can? Because I think most people want to do the best. It's just agreeing on what that is. So yeah, so it's definitely challenging.
No, you're absolutely, yeah. Like I think about even in recent context when American citizens have been asked about like what they think the part of like the American budget that goes towards like helping social programs versus what it is. It's like they think it's like 50% of their budget, but it's like actually 1% of the budget. And it's like, where's that 50% coming from? It's like an emotional perspective of they think that it is going elsewhere and not to themselves. And so you're absolutely right. Like the world as it is and the world as it can be, right? I think of also how like economists, like when they are analyzing the world, they're always starting off in a perfect world. This is how we would do this. But it's like, okay, but we don't live in a perfect
Yeah,
world,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, we definitely don't have a perfect world. And so it's sort of, I mean, I think I'm going to make a guess. I think many of the people on this call are probably more the world as it could be, should be
I would
types of
hope
people.
so, considering we're talking about AI and fairness in it. Okay, and Renee has a question. Said, as you mentioned in one of the slides, humans will base fairness on context. So ethical correctness is always dependent on circumstances. But can we say that in the end, whether we want it to or not, Darwinism will ultimately make the decision?
Yeah, wow, that's a big question, right? A couple of a couple of things I just want to call out, and I forgot to mention this, why the context piece is important. So think about what AI systems are trying to do. They're trying to generalize. Like if you
Right,
think about what are the fundamental principles of AI, is this idea of generalizing to the
right,
bigger population. And so context throws a bit of a spanner in the works for that, right? Like if the context, and we know this as humans, because once we get all the details in a story and we kind of unpack it, maybe it changes our mind. Maybe we're like convinced we're going with decision A, but then a bunch of stuff happens and we're like, maybe decision B is kind of the better one because of
right.
all these other things. We've all had that happen, right? But with an AI system, you don't really kind of get that level of nuance. And so right away, you almost have like an epistemic disagreement. Like, how will we know the things that we know? Well, we only know them based on this data set that we learned from, and that's it. We don't really consider all that. So that's part of it. As for the Darwinism part, can we say in the end whether or not, whether we want it or not, Darwinism will ultimately make the decision? I'm not so sure
Well,
I totally get that, but
I mean, I feel like with Darwinism, it wasn't actually about the it wasn't actually survival of the fittest. It was about the bird that can adapt to change. So I think in terms of the Darwinism context, like this entire presentation is talking about the world as it could be, and that's about like adapting to change, right?
oh, yeah. Oh, and there's some more context here. Budget or limited time can be formed. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I wrote a blog post. If you're interested in checking this out, I did an analysis of a paper that was written about an auto company, and they were trying to just define who are the good leads for,
Right.
to sales leads. And it goes through this whole process of, well, we think it should look like this, and they define it this way. And then they run into a roadblock and they're like, oh my gosh, we don't have that. So we're going to define it like this. And then they go to management and they say, hey, we need this money to buy this new data. It could be better. And management's like, sorry, you're not getting any more budget. Go back to the drawing board. And it just traces an ethnographic sort of study through their whole, and the whole thing ended badly in that the whole thing didn't work out and didn't get deployed at the end of the day. But you're right, Renee, in that there's all these kinds of things that happen that sort of impact the project that aren't just the technical, but they have to do with who's in power and who controls budget and all of these kinds of things. I think the best, again, going back to education, I try and work at this at different levels. So, hey, leaders, here's what you need to know about this. And then people who are building the technology, and then people who are using the technology. So there's different levels that I try and work in this kind of idea of, okay, how do we address this issue of fairness and bias and justice in AI systems?
Mhm. I see Sudha has her hand up. Sudha.
Thank you. This is a fun discussion. Renee has started the whole will Darwinism prevail towards the end. It's very unfortunate timing in the end. But when I saw that, I was actually thinking, from my experience, a diverse set of people come together to build AI, but then they may not be all equals, right? There will be data scientists who would say, no, I'm not going to change this because the data is saying so, and they've already picked the data. So I've seen kind of arguments. And again, like, let's think about this logically because there's emotions in the room, right? So I've seen that. So I was thinking, interpreting the Darwinism as who gets to make the decision in the company, in the room, who is there at the table yielding AI. But from a practical standpoint, I was thinking if you're thinking about the customers and the customers are of a certain profile, you're going to make your AI work for them. You cannot say, oh, AI doesn't work for a person of color, and then you're going and serving the Puerto Rico market, and it doesn't work, the customer is going to go to competition. So capitalism will be the setting
Right,
the
it has to
context here.
adapt to the change.
Right? So that's what I was thinking. If we focus on the customer to create value, especially for a business because they're focused on value as profit, I think it kind of takes care of a feedback loop there.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think that that is really true. And I would add to that, that if you want to see different AI, you as a consumer, you have a lot of power. So I often talk about the fair trade coffee version of generative AI, because generative AI, you think about the environmental impact it has because it's so massive. You think about the fact that people weren't paid for that data that was used in the training. But if you want to see the better, more fair version of that, you can go back to companies and say, look, why don't you build something better? And then I'm going to, I'll use your products and I'll tell other people about them. And I think we as consumers, we do have power. And in a capitalist society, that's one way we can definitely use our power to ask for better things, right? So I love that.
And do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share regarding your view on this and just what you hope for the world that could be?
Yeah, I think, I think we need to keep asking for the world that can be. It's been a tough year so far. We're only 2 months into this, right? And so we're on the cusp of International Women's Month, and personally, I found it to be a really, it's been a really just stressful type of time that we live in, seeing everything that's happening. But I guess I would just sort of encourage all of us, including myself, to keep asking for that world as it could be and keep doing our work in advancing that. I think it's worth it, even when the times feel really tough. So I guess that's sort of my last message to everyone, is to keep on keeping on.
Yeah, not accepting the bare minimum that they're putting out there. Right. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. This was so great. And honestly, I'm leaving 10 times happier than I came in, just being able to talk about this. So thank you so much for being here, Katrina. Please, if you'd love to come back in the future and talk to us more about fairness, we love having you here.
Absolutely. Love to come back. Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll be here next week. All right. Bye.
Thank you, Deepika.
Bye. Thank you.
Yeah. Can you not close the window completely? Because I just want to make sure that I add these comments out in LinkedIn because there are a lot of references. I don't want to go search for them again. So
sure. Yeah. Go ahead. Take your time, and then I'll make you the host, so then you can.
Okay. So then I want to make sure that, in Business School of AI on LinkedIn, where we shared this, I started sharing some of the resources, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Okay,
Awesome.
you're a host.
Very nice. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye, Sudha.